This is a little video about the right threads to use for opus anglicanum. I'm not actually going to do any sewing. I'm going to talk about what makes something opus anglicanum, that being the thread, and which choices of thread will make your piece of embroidery merely something in the style of opus anglicanum, because the thread choice that you use for opus is absolutely vital. For those of you who don't spin, thread is made up of many fibres twisted together. I've got here a piece of combed sheep's fleece, and different threads have different staple lengths. Now, the length of the staple is the length of the individual hair that makes up the fibre. Now, in wool, that can be anywhere between about 5 centimetres for some of the more ancient breeds and about 20 for something like a Wensleydale long wool. And the longer the length of the staple, the shinier the thread will be. And that goes as much for wool as for anything else. There are a lot of very shiny long wools. Blue-faced Leicester can be almost silken. And the standard way to make a thread is to pull that staple out from a bundle and to twist it. I'm doing it by hand here, but it can also much more commonly be done with a drop spindle or with a spinning wheel or with a machinery in modern times. Now, the most common embroidery thread that most people are used to is this one here. This is an ordinary household brand of 6-stranded embroidery cotton. Now, cotton as a fibre comes from a vegetable. It's grown in fields and its staple length is very, very short. It's something like 1 centimetre normally. So it's a very rough, dull fibre. It's not naturally a shiny fibre. The common embroidery cotton that you get, and I've had beginner embroiderers tell me that this is the only embroidery thread that they've ever known how to use. They don't even realise there are other options. But the trouble with cotton is, even when it's modern mercerised cotton, it's still dull. It's not very shiny. And what makes it even less shiny is the fact that each of the fibres is twisted. And the common way to make a thread, this is a 2-ply. It means that 2 long strands of cotton have been twisted and then those 2 long strands have been folded around each other. And if you take a piece and you unfold it, you can see it, those 2 strands either side of one another. And that twisting adds a texture to the fibre and makes it even less shiny. And then we have silks. Now, the easiest kind of silk that you can get hold of would be something like this. This is a 2-ply silk. This has the same basic structure as the embroidery cotton. It's made by twisting 2 strands together. Now, those 2 strands are a spun silk, not a filament silk. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute, but you can see that where it's twisted apart, it's made from quite short fibres of silk. And where I've started to pull those plies apart, they've actually begun to disintegrate under my hand. So you have to use that silk in its twisted form. And the twisted form of the silk makes it less shiny. So either of these is not an opus anglicanum thread, because opus anglicanum always uses this stuff. This is what's called a silk filament. I've actually got 4 strands of silk filament there because they're so very, very fine that you can barely see them. It's also known as reeled or flat silk. And what that is is it has an almost continuous staple length. Remember I talked about the staple length being the length of the fibre that is twisted to make the thread. It has an almost infinite staple length, because what this is this is the one long continuous fibre that is taken off a silkworm's cocoon. So it's very, very long and very, very shiny. And each one of these strands of filament will be made up of more than one silkworm cocoon. But that makes it shiny, and it's the shiny that's important. In period, the original pieces of opus anglicanum, of course, they never used cotton, because cotton was a very rare fibre in medieval Europe, more common in Italy and the southern Mediterranean than it was in northern Europe. And it would have been quite expensive, and well, if you're going to pay the same price, you're going to go for the silk, because silk is nicer. But you also don't get this in opus anglicanum. You don't get the plied threads. You occasionally get the odd bit used as an outline in later opus, and you get some thick two-ply silks that are underside couched. But the actual body of opus anglicanum, all of the drapery and the faces, those are always done in this stuff. Because when you do opus anglicanum, you're stitching with light. Because the thing that we forget about opus anglicanum is that you're not meant to be examining it with your nose pressed up against it like we do when we go to the V&A Museum or we pore through books. You're meant to see it from a distance, and you're meant to see it in a dark Gothic candle-lit cathedral during a festival day, high days and holidays. So what I've got here is this little blue spot here is split stitch. Now, some people will say it's opus anglicanum as long as you use split stitch. This is 2 strands of the embroidery cotton, and it's done in split stitch in a continuous spiral circle, the kind of thing that you would use to shape a piece of opus anglicanum. Now, you can see there's not a lot of shine on that. There is some, I'll grant you, but there isn't a great deal. Then, next to it, I've got a piece of 2-ply silk. It's actually this silk here, which is done in the same technique, split stitch in a continuous spiral. And straight away, even if I don't bring my little torch across, you can see that this is much, much shinier. That's because silk reflects light better than cotton does, even better than mercerized cotton does. So there is a bit more life in that. But if you look at that, you can still see the texture and the structure of the stitches. And the one thing that I always say to students when I'm teaching them opus anglicanum is that you should not be able to see an individual stitch. You're not thinking about the individual stitches in opus anglicanum. You're thinking about how banks and blocks of stitches are going to reflect the light. So up above here, it's not quite the same colour. This is a filament silk. This very pale one at the top is a filament silk. You can see I'm moving my little torch around there because it's easier than moving the frame. See the way the light bounces off that thing. See the way that it's filled with light and life in comparison to the others. Well, there is no comparison. This is opus anglicanum. This is a bastardized version of opus anglicanum, and this isn't opus anglicanum at all. When you're doing opus anglicanum, you are stitching with light, and it's the filament silk that reflects the light that makes it into opus anglicanum. And it's the way you structure and shape those stitches and the way the light bounces around on them that makes something opus anglicanum. So I've got this very strong directional light because it's easier to move the torch around than it is to move my frame up and down. And you can see how the light is reflecting off that, how the light is making that bounce, and the light is giving the stitches their shape as well. You can see the apple of the cheek and the curve of the nose and the mouth reflected in the shape of the stitch. And even though the stitch is flat, it's giving a dimension and a shape to the silk thread. That is opus anglicanum, that is not. And if you're going to learn opus anglicanum, filament silk is very difficult to use. I'm not going to lie to you, it is a badly behaved thread, but it's worth the bother. You know, my beloved is a pain in the arse. My cat is a pain in the arse. They're both worth the bother. You persist with things because they're worth the reward. And the reward with opus anglicanum is this wonderful shine and this shaping that you get from the way the stitches pack together. You should never be able to pick out an individual stitch. You should never be able to see a stitch in opus anglicanum. You should only see the shape of the light bouncing off the silk. And you shouldn't be thinking about the stitches. You should be thinking about how the light is going to bounce off the stitches. So, you know, if you want to learn opus anglicanum, do it properly. Do it with the filament silk. And if you're going to teach someone to do opus anglicanum, don't teach them using applied silk, because you're only getting half the point. You're missing most of the point of opus anglicanum unless you get that shine. I don't care how many qualifications someone's got. If they say that they're teaching you opus anglicanum and they're using a 2-ply silk, they don't understand opus anglicanum. And, you know, this is how you understand it. You have to understand the way the light moves across the silk. This is true opus anglicanum. This is in the style of opus anglicanum. This, I don't know what that is. That's modern thread painting. It's not opus. Opus anglicanum, it's all about the light. And that's all I've got to say.